everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on this gorgeous, very typical day, right? It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Serhy Yekelchyk. First, I'd like to acknowledge also that this event was supported by the Friends of Ukrainian Studies Fund in the Department of Slavic Studies. And especially I wanted to thank the Honorary Consul of Ukraine in Seattle, Mr. Valery Holorodko for his generous support. Also Simpson Center for Humanities for making available this venue. The Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures for a lot of administrative support. And if any of you would like to support our endeavors, you can go to the department's webpage, about and support, and you can support us there. I also wanted to share about some upcoming events. On Thursday, May 11th at 3:30 in Smith Hall Room 305, we'll have Dr. Volodymyr Dubovik talking about Russia's war in Ukraine implications for the wider Black Sea region and beyond. Please join for that. And also as a preview, this isn't officially announced yet, but on May 22nd in this room from 5 to 8, there will be a master class in Ukrainian folk singing. So keep an eye out for the official announcement that once some venue logistics get ironed out. So Professor Serhy Yekelchyk earned his BA from the University of Kyiv and his MA from the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. He conducted research in Australia in the early 1990s. And then he moved to Canada, where he completed his Ph.D. at the University of Alberta in 2000. And since 2001, he has taught at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, and there he is the professor of Germanic and Slavic Studies. And he currently serves as the president of the Canadian Association of Ukrainian Studies. And he is the author, I'm so impressed, of 7 books on modern Ukrainian history, Stalinism, and Russo-Ukrainian relations. His monograph, Stalin's Citizens, Everyday Politics in the Wake of Total War, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2014, received the Best Book Award from the American Association of Ukrainian Studies. And it was also, it got special recognition at the Lviv Book Forum. So he's getting recognition on both sides of the pond. Professor Yekelchyk's most recent book is in the Oxford University Press, What Everyone Needs to Know series. I think we could add to that, what everyone needs to know and what Putin does not want you to know series. So Ukraine, What Everyone Needs to Know, published in 2020. It is the go-to book for trying to help people understand what is going on and dispelling a lot of misinformation about the current war. And if you look for that, be sure to get the second edition, which came out in 2020, which is an updated version of an also popular book in that series by Professor Yekelchyk. So today, Professor Yekelchyk will talk to us about, explain to us what Ukraine is fighting for and why Putin does not want you to know this. Thank you, Professor Yekelchyk.
Thank you very much, Professor Pilonik, for your generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I need to reveal something really important. I do receive all your mailing list posts. That is because I actually have an honorary appointment in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, which I think I don't do much other than reading your server announcements, but it actually tells me that you are very active, and it's a pleasure to be here. So we do have quite a bit of a Ukrainian community in Victoria as well, and a tiny Ukrainian program with courses on Ukrainian history and introductory Ukrainian language. And actually this summer, somebody is teaching a course online on Ukrainian cinema. So we're trying to build, and we also have the endowment of Ukrainian studies as well. So I come from, fraternal program to which we are connected by so many links, living in Pacific Northwest, and basically engaged in the same kind of civic activism on behalf of Ukrainian democracy. and united we stand for that. So I used to be slightly ashamed about advertising my books, but that feeling completely disappeared at the moment in 2014 when Mr. Putin started the war in the Donbass and annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. So from now on, and not only that, but the book also has a highly unusual series name, What Everyone Needs to Know, which people typically assume as part of the title I came up with. It's not, actually. They forced it upon me, but there was actually a significant struggle about the title because the original contract was for the conflict in Ukraine, the crisis in Ukraine. Then the first edition was called The Conflict in Ukraine. And by then already it was clear that the language is significant. It's not the Ukrainian crisis, which happened somehow over there in Ukraine. And you would not also talk, for instance, of the Nazi invasion of France as the conflict in France, or let's say the conflict in Poland in 1930. And so when this importance of language was also stressed out by the fact that in Russia you cannot call this war by what it is, namely the term war is prohibited from all mass media, it becomes even more important that we do fight for the terminology and the names. And so I did. So we ended up with Ukraine. So it was a long fight, and the editorial board, the advisory board of Oxford University Press went. That's the American office, actually. I also published with the British office, or supposed to publish on it. And so they went along for it, and it's simply Ukraine. And so I have to start with a very, very brief introduction because I know you are an enlightened audience. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it other than to explain one important context. If we take a look at Ukraine on the map of Europe, here you would realize right away that the countries on Ukraine's west, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, those neighbors of Ukraine all belong to the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They therefore have made a political and military choice. They are not perfect, especially Hungary. I can go on for quite a bit. Poland now has a really, really good excuse now that the Polish families belong to Ukrainian refugees. But basically, they do not have to be perfect because in Ukrainian political imagination, Europe and the European Union in particular function as a metaphor of something very important, what you would perhaps call freedom in the United States. Canada is not as big on the freedom language. Also, the rule of law, democracy, and perhaps a meaningful struggle against corruption. So all of these things, and also economic opportunity, prosperity, developed system of social services, all of this inscribed into that metaphor of Europe. The real Europe is not like that, it's not necessarily like that, and more Ukrainian families are finding out what the real Europe is, but they are still great, and they still work with the same symbol, with the same metaphor of what the European choice is. Because it is fairly strange, actually, to proceed from this point to my next one, namely about the long history of imperial past in the case of Ukraine. Because you see, Europe is a fairly ambiguous choice. If you want to work through the period of imperial domination of your nation, then longing for Europe is counterfactual, because in most cases, for colonialism, Europe is the colonizer. In this particular case, it functions very differently. It actually functions as a symbol of destroying the old dynastic empires and building a new system politically, socially, and economically. So therefore, Europe can actually be an anti-colonial metaphor too, which I know is a tough sell, especially to those from Europe or working in European academia. But that's what it is in the Ukrainian background. And then, of course, if you look at the states on the north and east, I'm not going to talk about Turkey today because that will require a very long lecture. And Professor Dubovik, who will show up here soon, I'm actually going to miss his lecture in Victoria. I will be away because he is stopping by our university as well. He will be able to enlighten you on Turkey's very peculiar position on the war. But nevertheless, if you look to the east and north, Belarus and Russia envelop Ukraine almost from more than two sides. And this is the neighborhood in which we enter with the concept of the empire. We need it in order to process the war as it is happening now, and also to think about the possible ways forward, what may potentially happen later. So we need them to bring in the empires and the transformation of the map of Europe from empires to so-called nation states, which are also not perfect at all. In fact, nation states are connected to all kinds of ethnic violence. But nevertheless, the empires do go through a rather dramatic but an important process of acknowledging the fact that they are no longer imperial, right? We know it is dramatic. Usually for Canadian students, I would say, our own king, but of course it's not yours. So our own king, as is well known, was shocked by the fact that he would need to remove an I from the coins, that he would be R, Rex, but not imperator, not the emperor, when India became independent, right? And in fact, Canada is only now going through this process of working through its colonial past. And in Victoria, we had some statues going into the water, that of Captain Cook, the statue of Queen Victoria attacked repeatedly with red paint and other mediums. So that history of decolonization is finally catching up with Canada and the British Empire as well. But of course, the problem is that once you start going through it, and if that happens to involve the empire which has not processed its own status, you can get into a long and violent process. It's particularly difficult for France, for instance, to deal with the fact that the African colonies would gain independence. That became a long process. It became a national trauma which needed to be processed by the imperial masters in France. It involved racial considerations, involved in considerations of exploitation and other such things. But then, of course, there are also situations in world history which you will be familiar with when it is not as easy to distinguish between the empire and the territory it dominates culturally and politically. And here, of course, in Canada, my reference would be straight away, you know what the relation of Scotland to England is, right? So it is different and yet ours. It is part of us in our imperial pursuit of building an empire, and yet it is sufficiently different and also now running through various referenda about Scottish independence, and also universities are switching to being bilingual. You get bilingual websites. So there is a rediscovery of heritage, rediscovery of culture. And of course, my second comparison in Canada is normally that of Ireland to England, where there is an attempt to incorporate, to make part of body politic and body cultural, but there is also that forever suspicion of a component which can undermine the imperial identity. So you get all of that in a cocktail, in a single drink, in the case of Russia and Ukraine, unfortunately, right? So for both, for the Russian Empire, the issue of dealing with imperial legacy was never properly processed. A dear friend of mine, Professor David Brandenberger, published a book about the process in the 20th century when the Russian national identity actually started developing, but it never developed fully because it was never fully separated from the identity of the Soviet Union itself. And of course, the Russian Empire also never really reached the point of acknowledging Ukrainians as a separate ethnic group. The Russian Empire preferred to see in terms of three Eastern Slavic nations, in fact, constituting the tribes of a greater Russian nations, and that's precisely the term that was used, the tribes. So what you then get is the only very brief period in the 1920s, and maybe about 7 days in 1991, when there was, or there seemed to be, an inclination on the part of the Russian elites or Bolshevik Soviet elites to actually process that imperial past in some way. The Bolsheviks didn't just do it of goodness of their hearts, because they realized that they needed to establish control over a large multi-ethnic territory. So there was actually a very real reason. It was like the peasants forced the Bolsheviks to make certain concessions. The nationalities issue also, in fact, was forced upon them too. But then, as I said, in 1981, it took how many days? What Ukraine proclaims independence on August 24th? Well, actually, it's 3 days. On August 27th, the press secretary of President Yeltsin of Russia, who up until that point is actually seen in Ukraine as a great Democrat, a friend, an ally, and people think, I did as well, I was a graduate student at the time, that, wow, maybe we can live, in peace with normal democratic Russia. Maybe I didn't have to lose all my friends in Russia and my colleagues. But so it lasted 3 days. And 3 days later, on August 27th, the press secretary of President Yeltsin makes an announcement that republics cannot just leave. They can only leave after concluding a treaty with Russia, which would account for a territorial settlement. So that effectively making a territorial claim without specifying in a statement what the republics would be, but then of course the press secretary, who didn't receive clear instructions from President Yeltsin, and President Yeltsin, even on his sober days, was not particularly known for clear instructions. So Pavel Vovshanov, his press secretary, basically at a press conference blurted out, well, that's Ukraine, that's Kazakhstan, and that's Moldova. And everybody says, oh, I see, okay. So you just basically made territorial claims on 3 newly independent states. And here goes our honeymoon of, living with democratic Russia, lasted 3 days total, 3 days. Okay, and what this means, of course, is that this imperial ideology is so seductive, and it is so available to explain out all kinds of things, to explain out, to the collapse in the standard of life, the failure of economic reforms, the privatization, which basically steals from the people in order to create a class of, super wealthy few. And then, of course, it also didn't help that Ukrainian identity, too, just like the Russian one, was not clearly defined at that point. But it did start the process of defining itself in a very interesting way. In 1988, in June, a group of people showed up in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, close to the Polish border, near the monument to a local poet, Ivan Franko. And that was the very first unofficial rally in the Republic when people actually showed up and started making speeches. And the rallying point for them was, in fact, the Ukrainian language. However, in the eastern and central part of Ukraine, the rallying point at that time was slightly different. That was Chernobyl, the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe, which basically demonstrated that the Soviet authorities were criminals. They wanted essentially to harm their own people. So what then was happening in Ukraine in 1988 and up to 1991, this brief 3 years before independence, was in fact the society coming together on a very interesting platform. On a platform in which everybody is deeply upset with the Soviet experience. But this protest sentiment finds its expression in a discourse which essentially was ambivalent, which was about the society in general, but also about specifically the Ukrainian national forms. And so during that period, something very interesting happened. The mass Popular Front was created based on a politic model. It was called the People's Movement of Ukraine for Perestroika. And of course, the Ukrainian term for movement, and all of you should be taking Ukrainian courses here or at some other university, is Ruch, movement. And so that movement somehow managed to include both streams. It actually featured a very notable representation of minorities, Russian, Jewish, others as well. These people actually came together and they felt that there was no contradiction between restoring one historical justice by restoring the rights of the Ukrainian language and culture, and the other, allowing society active presence and actually destroying the Soviet system. These two things didn't have to contradict each other. They worked together. And that is actually a phenomenon which is perhaps quite understandable for us living in the 21st century, when we acknowledge the rights of the languages and the rights of the people who previously lived on this territory and from whom this territory, let's say, was stolen in some kind of treaty, right? So that is basically the same impetus, restoring justice, fighting injustice. And there seemed to be no contradiction. And what it actually did, it actually formed the Ukrainian cause and the Ukrainian language as a platform for people who did not necessarily speak Ukrainian. And that historical moment happened twice. First in 1988 to 1991, and then recently in the two revolutions in Ukraine in 2004 and 2013. The moment at which you get sociologists polling the population and asking them about the Ukrainian language, and then you get a very curious answer. First, they ask about the importance of the Ukrainian language. The majority says it is really important. It is actually a symbol of, restoring statehood, restoring nationhood, restoring the rights of the people, and doing historical wrongs. But then there is a second tricky question. Do you actually speak Ukrainian? And the majority says no. But not yet, they say, right? And that is the moment when we realize, okay, so there is again now, as was the case when I was a grad student, the understanding that we are all the same movement. And this is an important part, and we need to acknowledge this important part. And that is why I wanted to show you this image, which I'm actually from Kyiv, Ukraine. All of us in the family are from Kyiv, Ukraine. So, in Ukraine, you cannot really get a crowd like that, but something which would be based exclusively on the Ukrainian national agenda, let's say the Ukrainian language. No way. Estimates based on satellite photographs give us up to 1 million people on some weekends during the Revolution of Dignity, which is also known as Euromaidan. That means it is much, much bigger than that. It means that movement became an expression of not just the national cause, but the national cause actually subsumed, included into itself the other things, like struggling against corruption, for the rule of law, for joining Europe, even we don't really know what Europe is, but we have a pretty good idea what we like in Europe. And that is the kind of agenda, and especially, also, we don't want to live in a dictatorship. And we don't want to live in a shadowy people's republic, which basically is based economically on human trafficking and drugs and arms and whatever, where your kids need to cross the border into Ukraine in order to get a certificate about graduation and things like that, which was fairly clear during the war, especially when the Russian army took the city of Kherson. So we don't get a package. That package is again combined with the Ukrainian national cause, with the agenda, with Ukrainian language and culture and the sovereignty of Ukraine. But it includes so much more. And then you get people who actually don't speak Ukrainian, who during the polling say, well, the Ukrainian language is very important. I don't speak it yet, but something needs to be done about it. And I will do that soon. So this is what we get. But it also points to something else. During the first mobilization in 1988-91, political and cultural mobilization, and also social protest against, the standards of life, exploitation, the directors controlling the factories and such. During that particular mobilization back then, There were events that today would be difficult to imagine. But perhaps today is the time when we can start imagining them again. One of the largest events in Ukraine during that period was, in fact, a meeting in the largest stadium, sports arena in the country, in Kyiv, to mourn the death of a prominent Russian dissident, academician Andrei Sakharov, a famous nuclear physicist who also became known as an advocate of democracy, actually the rights of nation. He very clearly expressed his position that the nations must have the right to leave the Soviet Union. And actually he went beyond that, about the nations of the Russian Federation itself. And so you get one of the huge crowds gathering in that sports arena to talk about a person whom they saw on television from Russia. But he was seen as very much part of the Ukrainian movement. So there was that moment when it seemed that the Russian democracy has a promise. It can actually be together with Ukrainians, but I did tell you about the 3 days of training, right? And Pavel was explaining which republics in particular would be subjects of territorial claims. So, and that moment, of course, was not forgotten. The documents are in the archives of the Ukrainian Party archive. All the speeches made there, all the moments of imagining the possibility of burying the empire together. But of course, that's precisely what now makes it even more different, because you don't get such democratic voices from Russia. So very famously, not a single Russian politician after the annexation of the Crimea made any noises about the Crimea actually being legally, and if you look at the history, historically, definitely not Russian. That was a journalist, Ksenia Sobchak, who said in an interview, but you know what, the Crimea is Ukrainian. And then she took a pause and said, according to international law, right? And so beyond that, there was no voice like that until actually very recently, the voice of Alexei Navalny, the previously poisoned, now imprisoned leader of the Russian opposition, suddenly issuing a statement saying what is going to happen after Ukraine wins the war. That is a very interesting statement. But the most important fact is that it was issued. It indicates something important, something people used to believe in. And here is why. Because Mr. Putin's, in addition to not acknowledging the Ukrainian nation as separate and having the right to self-determination, Mr. Putin is also worried mightily by pictures like that. That was actually a protest. It's not, not as central, and you couldn't fit all that many people into the Bolotnaya bloodshed as you could on the Maidan in Kyiv. It was actually a very heterogeneous politically movement, but so was the Ukrainian one. There was a famous almost conflict between the socialist feminists and the right-wing militia of the Maidan. At some point, they showed up and said, the organizers said to the right-wing guys, don't go harassing the socialist feminist crowd, because we here represent all kinds of ideological agendas. And so it was in Russia as well. Actually, my graduate students, I had one graduate student who grew up in the eastern part of Germany and speaks nearly native Russian. So basically, by the point when they put him in the police van, and a few policemen showed up with batons to beat up everybody inside the van, he reached for his German passport. Right. So, but he was there all the time, and he's how to put it, hard left, kind of almost Stalinist, really. Not quite. So there were various political representations there, but of course the very fact of such a rally was, for Mr. Putin, a signal that Russia is getting the Ukrainian flu, and that Ukrainian flu, which he also blamed on the West, but it really was something called democracy. So we are then dealing with more than imperial collapse. We are dealing more with having to process the fact that you need to acknowledge that, Scotland can perhaps vote. Actually, Quebec in Canada, I came to Canada for the first time in 1995. Just a few months before the referendum, when I thought, here we go again, yet another country is going to be disintegrating here. But of course, that was the last referendum. And there are multiple reasons which would require a long lecture about why Quebec is going to stay. But of course, Mr. Putin's big fear is not just about the presence of Ukraine undermining Russian imperial identity, that is to say, the ethnic, the nation, which is never really formed because it is identified so closely with a federal state, but also something else in Russian identity. That Western flu, that Ukrainian, bug, which is called democracy and civil society, and that's precisely what Mr. Putin wanted to stamp out. And that's a peculiar kind of a war as well, because in Ukraine, if you really look at various graphics, which is traditionally used to measure the influence of civil society, the registered NGOs per whatever 1,000 persons and things like that, you wouldn't get a typical picture of a strong civil society. But that's because it functions differently. It does not function through the Western model of NGOs, but actually through mobile, agile networks of people, through basically being on social media and doing things through that without formal necessarily membership in any group. I don't know if Andrei Lubka has visited Seattle. He came to Victoria a few years back, and we took him to the restaurant, and he said, oh, that was his first lobster he ate in his life. And we had a really interesting audience show up for his talk, much younger ones, because when Andrukhovich came, I thought Andrukhovich is so big in Ukrainian culture. The full room, no, who is Andrukhovich? Whatever. Andrei Lubka, suddenly people show up I haven't seen on campus ever. So Andrei just basically decided to raise money for trucks for the Ukrainian army. And at first he thought he would maybe buy 10 trucks by asking the people who follow him on social media. And he is now, I think, 126 trucks later. He is not an organization. There is no NGO. There is no formal structure. There is basically a person who is, an opinion maker, a person who is liked and trusted by a significant group of people for a variety of reasons, a writer. And that is actually a very good example of what kind of civil society has developed in Ukraine that is reliant on its own channels of communication. And if you really ask me hard to think about why, the answer would be probably the Soviet experience, because all these civic organizations in the Soviet Union were, of course, fake and obligatory membership, and they didn't do anything, right? And every time I publish a book on Stalinism, which I do every now and then, in addition to these more important things, the name of the archive I have to cite is the Ukrainian Archive of Civic Organizations. But really, it is the party archive. Like the party itself is a civic organization. So this is a kind of a Soviet vaccination, the Soviet inoculation against the formal structures of civil society. But the society exists nevertheless. Let's see. I have plenty of so maybe let's look at those two guys. And so what do I mean here? One of the most famous posts, it's now disputed whether in fact the post by Mustafa Nayyem on Facebook was the one which started the revolution, because apparently there were dozens of influential posts on social media on that very night, but his one became important. And the thing I like about that is, of course, that his name is Mustafa. Right. So it makes it really, really difficult for Mr. Putin to say that the Ukrainian Nazis started that illegal coup and rebellion because the guy's name is Mustafa, and he didn't even speak Ukrainian until being elected to the Ukrainian parliament eventually. Right. So here you go right away. And of course, the example of Volodymyr Zelensky, who But even so, he fought against President Poroshenko in a fight which politically was seen as a contest of the legacy of the revolution. But really, if you think it through, the very arrival of Volodymyr Zelensky to Ukrainian presidency, with his Jewish identity not becoming an issue on the campaign trail ever, even so he openly acknowledged it, right? It is, in fact, the consequence of the revolution, the consequence of the kind of society the two revolutions in Ukraine actually constructed. And he, too, made it very difficult for Mr. Putin to argue that the Ukrainian Nazis, it's just chaos, chaos needs to be straightened out and things like that, because, well, that's a Jewish president with really bad optics to the Russian plan to kill the Ukrainian Jewish president. That really rings all kinds of bells and raises all kinds of flags for people who know the history of World War II. Suddenly, Mr. Putin, instead of, this wearing this mantle of the second Stalin, becomes more like a second Hitler. Not nice. Okay, so, and maybe that's not the only moment. Okay, I just need to switch to another PowerPoint, because I have a bit too many PowerPoints today, which is fairly normal. Because, yeah. The magic was working. Okay, so because really, what would then be the foundation for Mr. Putin if he could not use the most important component of his mythology, the great victory by Russia in World War II against the West and Ukraine? West and Ukraine, right? Because if you read the Russian media, which I do as a force of habit, but also particularly for research now, and that is painful, especially in the morning. The evening is somewhat better, especially if you're serving red wine, But nevertheless, if you read only the Russian media, you would think that World War II, in fact, was fought by Russia alone against the West and Ukrainian Nazis. There was also Hitler somewhere in the picture, but he is really not all that important. So in this picture of the world, people like Mustafa Nayyem and Volodymyr Zelensky serve as important symbols of the scheme not working, no traction. You don't get traction even within the Russian mythology itself. So I took it from the class. I teach a course on modern Ukraine and Russo-Ukrainian conflict, which I also need to rename to remove the conflict. But I have to tell you that my original proposal was the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. And then a smart person sitting on the committee, the curriculum committee, said, "You think it's the last one? So let's remove the and leave the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, because that is going then to be the background," and he was totally right on the money. So here we have Mr. Putin thought, oh no, that's not the one I need, or do I? Yeah, okay, this is the one. This is the military history stuff. And that class does quite a bit of military history too. So the original design for the war is in fact very telling, right? So the simultaneous invasion in 4 operational areas is very rarely attempted in military history, especially in recent decades. Let alone sending paratroopers on helicopters in central Kiev. So when you do that, then the calculation is in fact that perhaps sending the paratroopers on helicopters would be enough, because the Ukrainian state would collapse. Because it's not a real state. Because there are only some Ukrainian Nazis and the strange Jewish president they have, it wouldn't just work. Well, thing is, sending the paratroopers didn't work at all. And it would not have worked. But what is in fact very revealing is the belief of the Russian leadership in the fact that Ukraine was prepared to collapse almost on its own. And because I also teach World War II, and I teach the Eastern Front, and I no longer teach Soviet history anymore, but I teach all kinds of things. I happen to know who was the last major politician who said, "You just kick in the door with your boot, and the building will come down." That was Hitler talking about the Soviet Union. So, for all these Russian textbooks celebrating the wonderful achievements of great Stalin in World War II, you're supposed to know that that was the thing, really. Not to mention, of course, the assumption, which is shown by the invasion in 4 operational areas, that in fact the Russophone Russian-speaking Ukrainians and ethnic Russians living in Ukraine would immediately then switch sides, would welcome the Russian tanks with flowers, which of course did not happen for the totally different reasons. But the very assumption that it might happen, of course, also indicates that Mr. Putin's thinking is informed by the notion of ethnic belonging, which we are very familiar from history textbooks. I teach about it. Blood and soil. That's the ideology in which your race, in a sense, Hitler used this term, determines your allegiance. So if Mr. Putin thinks that Russian speakers and ethnic Russians would switch sides, it means he's making assumptions based on an ethnic model, which is typical of the mid-20th century, right? It also means he doesn't realize, or at least he hasn't realized at that point, that he's dealing with a very different type of a political community in Ukraine. Yet to us, professors and students, it is very recognizable. That's what we teach in our classes. It is an imagined community of people making the same political choice. That's what it is. That's why you got Mustafa Nayem, right? And it also means then that it is actually a 21st century nation is being fought by the empire coming from the mid-20th century, from the 1940s really. That's what it is. And it basically answers all kinds of questions right away about how this is going to end, right? Eventually, finally. And of course, I should not pass in silence the city of Kherson in southern Ukraine, the only provincial capital which was taken by the Russian troops, but also the one where people immediately showed up in central Kherson with slogans protesting the Russian invasion, written, of course, in Russian, and waving Ukrainian flags. And I've been to Kherson twice. I don't remember seeing too many Ukrainian-speaking people in Kherson, but here they were in the city center, protesting the Russian invasion. And of course, what was the most stunning thing was the fact that the young Russian soldiers, at that point, quite a few of them conscripts, coming from, deep Russia, whatever, middle Russia, have never seen a public protest. And they actually didn't know you could organize a public protest. And they didn't know how to react to that, because it turns out that the Russian military are not trained to deal with public protest, because Mr. Putin has a highly paid and very numerous riot police. So the outcome in Kherson, there's a long story behind it, but the short story is this. The Russian authorities send riot police units into Ukraine to actually deal with protests in occupied territories, the non-violent protests by civilians. But the Ukrainian army just happened to intercept that convoy of the riot police. Right? So there's so many things at which this war really hits all this historical, buttons. Oh, I know what it is. I know what it is. I know how this is going to end. This is familiar. I teach about it in those courses and these courses and things like that. So essentially, then there is also one of the questions I sometimes get, especially, Victoria is a capital of retired diplomats. We have the second largest Canadian International Council organization after Ottawa. All these former ambassadors, the military attachés, and people who think they know, right? And the question I often get is, of course, but what about the rise of the ethnic Russian in Crimea? And then I have to say, I need a 2-hour lecture. But if you can give me 5 minutes, maybe I can make a few points. And then, of course, the big points that have to be, what do you mean by the Russians, right? 24% of the Crimean population is in fact ethnic Ukrainian, but it is mobilized primarily as ethnic Russians. It's actually the same in Transnistria, another Russian-controlled state as part of Moldova. The overwhelming majority of the population in Transnistria is actually ethnic Ukrainian, but they are mobilized politically as Russians. And this is because they want to identify with that empire. And of course, the legacy of the empire is connected to the Russian identity. And so we get Ukrainians in Transnistria and Ukrainians in Crimea mobilizing for something. And that something is actually not Russia at all. And then, of course, the second component of the story which has to come in is the Crimean Tatar, which needs to be explained about modern genocide, about people being, in fact, what settlers, many of them first-generation settlers, about racism being a significant part of the picture in the Crimea. And so I feel so awkward to, enlightened Canadian diplomats, even more so because they are retired. So I now realize that they spend the entire life in Canadian diplomatic service not having a clue, right? And now in retirement, they just try to challenge me during the lecture, which of course is slightly alleviated by the fact that the lecture usually takes place at the posh club over lunch, and everybody is drinking some alcoholic drinks. So it's easier for me to say, oh, let me see if we can go into the 19th century. Remember that what the Crimean War? Everybody says, yeah, the Crimean War. We won the Crimean War. That's in Canada, right? So we won the Crimean War. Well, the thing is, during the Crimean War, there was in fact a humanitarian operation, which is not widely reported in history textbooks. And that was the Allies saving the Crimean Tatars from the Crimea and relocating them primarily to the Ottoman Empire, because they felt that they were being disenfranchised. The land was being taken from them already in the 1850s. There is quite a bit of a history there, which clicks with Canadian history quite a few moments ago. I've been going on for quite a while. That's what you get for being a professor who teaches primarily 80-minute classes. It's programmed in your mind. I have to go for 80 minutes. I have to go for 80 minutes, right? And of course, perhaps, and of course, I don't have to deal with NATO, right? You are the enlightened audience. I don't have to talk about the NATO, about the obvious fact that in Ukraine, in fact, the notion of joining the NATO never had majority support ever until the Russian invasion. Perhaps I don't have to talk about the fact that nobody in the NATO actually wanted Ukraine until that happened. In 2008, in what was at the time classified information, Germany and France decisively blocked any discussion of Ukrainian admission to the NATO. A few years later, it was basically revealed in the media. And also one of the retired diplomats in Victoria told me about that over drinks, right? So the NATO didn't plan it. It still doesn't really want it. There was no support in Ukraine. And the only thing why the NATO is in the picture is because it fits beautifully in Mr. Putin's explanation of world history. And of course, if you read the Russian media, which once again, I would not recommend, but I have to do it, then the idea is, of course, that the NATO started the war. We just preempted it, because if we were not to attack Ukraine, NATO was about to attack us through Ukraine. And then, in fact, this conspiracy theory is widely circulates in the West as well. And I can go on and on and on. So here we are then. Mr. Putin is in trouble. And you know what? He has no plan B. Because none of the plans would work, because all of them were based on a very specific notion, which included the unprocessed imperial legacy of Russia, and also the typical for the mid-20th century notion about your ethnic identity and the language you speak determining your political allegiances, misunderstanding the notion of political communities in our time and such. He has no plan. And of course, that is in fact the moment which we must regret, because numerous Western journalists somehow seem to assume that Mr. Putin is just like a rational actor in a neoliberal state, that he realizes he's a criminal, he knows he's in trouble, And he perhaps would want to make a deal with the Western prosecutors. I actually heard this last week from an actual Western prosecutor. We are going to be presenting at the same round table on May 1st, which has like hundreds of people signed up online and in person with our booked the largest university auditorium, and I'm now so worried. Because that particular prosecutor just basically gave me a chat over lunch about how we should be able to make a deal with Mr. Putin. But of course, Mr. Putin does not function as a rational liberal politician who is considering options. Am I going to end up in prison or not? He doesn't care, really. It's all about the legacy. He sees himself as his press secretary famously or perhaps infamously revealed in the company of Ivan the Terrible, Peter I, and Catherine II. That's actually a quite funny company, really, if you have the Western image of who these people were, as opposed to the Russian image. But apparently, Mr. Putin takes advice from them, right, in his universe. And that also means that he's going to continue the war. And that makes me sad for a variety of reasons. I don't believe for a moment that there will be a Russian victory in the war. The victory will most definitely be Ukrainian. Problem is, precisely because Ukraine is mobilized politically and socially, it can sustain a long, but that would be the worst outcome, right? Because when you read about who fights on both sides, and you read the biographies of the fallen, you realize, of course, as you know, that the Russian government is recruiting for private military companies, in fact, the convicts. Some of them serve in terms for murder, gangsterism, all kinds of things. There was this recent thing on one of those Russian still liberal outlets about the Russian soldier who received a medal for courage, and then people from his small town say, oh, but he's the one who put on fire his mom and sister. So he basically killed his mom and sister in a particularly gruesome way, but now he's a hero, right? So, and then when you see the people on the Ukrainian side who my Facebook bubble are discussed as the casualties of this war, mourned, they are the people whose names are familiar. They are the people who organized movement for, cleaning the forests, picking up garbage from the beach, really. These are the components of civil society which then translated into mass support of the war. We get what opera singers, very famously the one who in fact was performing in Paris on contract but went back to fight and died. Ballet dancers, musicians, a number of historians. I actually have at least two colleagues who are slightly older. And of course, the upper age of service is 60. So one colleague of mine was recently after suffering, he was shell-shocked twice, and then he turned 60, and they told him, well, go home. So he went back to teach political science at his home university. And then the top authority on Ukrainian literature of the 19th century, the #1 person in the field, is in fact in the army now. So I see his Facebook posts. And I often think, what if he dies? That would be, we would lose such an authority in that field, which would take decades to rebuild. And he must be approaching 60 as well, too. Plenty of volunteers are. And so that also tells you, you know how this is going to end. What we don't know is how long this is going to take and what kind of casualties Ukraine would sustain in this fighting. But we know there are already signals. And one of the signals is, in fact, the statement from Alexei Navalny that they know as well that Ukraine is going to win. And they are starting to think about how we then process that fact. And Navalny came up with this theory about, after we are defeated, the West would remove the sanctions, which would allow us to make a ton of money selling oil and gas, which money would then go to Ukraine in indemnities and other damage payments, but we will still have enough to rebuild the beautiful Russia of the future. How about the denazification of Russia? and we insert that particular point. You all know so well what denazification is. Every Russian newspaper, day and night, is publishing about denazification of Ukraine. Not so much recently, kind of shutting up on this. Also, by the way, if you noticed, first it was the Ukrainian Nazis who fought the Russian army, then it was the Ukrainian nationalists who fought the Russian army, and by now it is the armed forces of Ukraine who are fighting the Russian army. So they are also changing the language in the media as well. Yeah, so here we are. It is time for me then to say that what can we do? We can do a ton of things, it turns out. My next door neighbor on our street, just a house in front of ours, had a basement. And then one day, 2 Ukrainian women from the city of Dnipro showed up, living there for free. We are a small town in Victoria. It is an affluent small town, lots of retirees with means. It is a very significant effort to assist the displaced Ukrainians. It's also a very significant effort for a rather small Canadian town to help out with fundraising for the medical supplies and for just about everything. And something else happened too. 2 groups of Ukrainian diaspora, those who originate from, the post-World War II generation, and those who came in the 1990s and early 2000s, primarily as economic migrants, came together in this effort. And then those of us studying Ukrainian diaspora no longer have to worry about its survival into the future. It has a cause, it has a new group of people who are very clearly on the side of the revolution. In fact, we have a lawyer in town who participated in the revolution of granite, which is in 1990, a hunger strike of Ukrainian students on that very same central square of Kiev, which is on Maidan as an overhead. So basically, we know how this is going to end. We don't know when and what kind of damage Ukraine is going to sustain, but we should never give up. And the other thing I tell my students, join the NGOs, because in the West, that's a signal that you are an active participant of the civil society. You can still work on social media and with your friends, but do go and support some NGOs. Let nobody challenge the notion that there is a strong civil society in Canada. And also, the implications for decolonization in Canada. Recently, new research topics showed up. Some of my colleagues are now working on the period of early Ukrainian immigration into Canada, when the dirty Ukrainian peasants were much despised by the Anglo-Saxon elites. And in fact, there was an objective community between the Aboriginals and those peasants who didn't speak English, who was, you live over there on the land. Turns out there was actually a cultural cross-contamination between these 2 groups. So it, in fact, allows us to do things in our own society, and by so doing, contribute to this global struggle, which Ukraine one day will win, and I hope this day is coming soon. Now, thank you. I need to take questions.
Thank you so much for fascinating lecture. I invite you all to ask questions.
I have a question. Okay, because you continue to say like we know how it's going to end, and I just wanted to know like the source of the certainty. What is behind it? Because like I don't know. So
yeah, I remember there was a moment in December when the Western intelligence agencies went public with the information they had about the numerical strengths of the Russian troops around Ukraine, standing at about 200,000, maybe 250,000. And all the experts said, this is very odd, because experts on modern warfare realized that that would not be enough to take Ukraine, let alone control it. You cannot really control major urban areas as well if if the population is resisting. You cannot use armor these days in the city. They tried on the first about maybe 4 days. So there are objective criteria about, so you would need an army of 2 million people fighting. Whether they can gather an army like that is in fact a big question. Of course, the early period of the invasion failed because this colossal mechanized column which advanced toward Kiev turned out to be stuck. So logistically and in terms of moving armor, Russia couldn't manage that. So they cannot really do it. And then there's the Che Guevara rule, Che Guevara rule. If the population supports the insurgents, good luck with eliminating the insurgency, right? Which actually worked in European history as well. So if you have the insurgency which is popular and the population provides support and cover for the insurgents, that will require an enormous effort of this state. But I think Mr. Putin really, okay, so I said that one of his topics, even so he doesn't say so openly, is in fact fighting the civil society in his own country, right? So he has created a state which sort of can control mostly public spaces, but we know that, younger professionals and students and lots of our colleagues, they're against the war and whatever. There are various ways of being against the war, right? So not only he would have to conquer all of Ukraine, and that's the country the size of France, basically, but he would have to have enough security personnel and army personnel to control it in the same way. And that is just not feasible. That just wouldn't work. Doesn't have the logistical, and even his own population can, in fact, rebel at some point. Even so, it doesn't look likely now, but just last week, to the dormitories of Moscow State University, the calling papers were delivered to students saying, well, your time to serve in the army blood. So when that happens, when the younger urban professional crowd gets hit, that would generate protest in big cities. And then Mr. Putin is not, of course, going to live forever. I have these moments when I lecture about Hitler saying, well, December 1941, World War II is basically lost because of the Battle of Moscow, and you just declared the war on the United States. Even so, you didn't have to, but being Hitler, you declared it anyway. Okay, well, and then, Hitler getting this flu in 1942, staying in the bunker in Ukraine near the city of Vinnytsia, nearly dying, not quite dying. And then there's a certain. So I'm thinking about Mr. Putin. We have no clear reading about what is going to happen when he dies. But there was one great leader before him who died. That was Stalin. Turned out he was mortal. Also turned out that right after his death, the system started the process of liberalization because everybody around him understood that Stalinism could not be continued by the same means. Right? So, and also, if it is a new Cold War, we have fought the Cold War already once. I was on the other side, but I was listening to the shortwave radio. Oh, wow, the Voice of America. They're going to read some cool novels. There's really good music on BBC and things like that. But you don't listen to the Albanian radio because it's all about communism. So we've done it once. We now live in the world of internet. And I believe that the Second Cold War can be won as well, too. So they don't have the logistics to control Ukraine. There is no way. In fact, the Russian army is more likely to collapse in an effort to do so. It is also more likely that it is produce a social discontent in other areas if they even try to raise an army like that. There will be consequences for Ukraine if this goes that way, but also, well, there's this wonderful signal recently about the disagreement within the Russian Ministry of Defense. And Mr. Putin's former coup, who now runs this wonderful private military company, which recruits from prisons in Russia, and now apparently trying to recruit from Central African Republic or somewhere, from some African satellite in Russia. So all kinds of, and that basically tells you, wow, that moves the notion of colonialism at the entire new level when you try to recruit prisoners from Tsar somehow. Anyway, so if there are conflicts, and usually they are around dictators, there is some hope. So I'm not particularly pessimistic about that. They would not be able. They would not be able to do so. We just don't know how this is going to unfold. I can go on for some time about negotiations. That would not work at that point. But maybe at some future point. I will take more questions. Lots of hands. You go first, please.
Sorry, easy one. Could you please repeat the name of the guy who was raising money for trucks? 140 trucks.
Андрей Любка.
Incidentally, there's a entrepreneur in Latvia, Estonia, sorry, doing exactly the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
His name is Ragnar Sauce.
Oh, yeah.
They've just sent their 15th convoy.
Wendy, yeah, we know our best friends in Victoria are Latvian Canadians, but they're doing so much. Like it really grants new meaning, you know, standing together in the face of the state which positions itself as an arbiter of those lesser nations. Yeah. So that's an easy one. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe she was. Yeah.
Do you ever see in the future where most of Ukraine actually speaks Ukrainian?
Yeah, will happen. It will happen. Yep, absolutely. I think my colleague Tim Snyder is somewhat confused in his proposal to claim Russian as another language of Ukraine, as the democratic version of Russian spoken in Ukraine. He means well, but he just confused about this. But Ukraine will become inevitably more Ukrainophone, and that would be a process historians are very familiar with. Moreover, an authority like Stalin himself said that would happen. Prague was primarily German-speaking in the 19th century. In the 20s, it becomes a Czech city. So there is a logic to that. There is a logic which comes with the notion of dismantling the empire which relies on settlers in big cities. Because really, this is the thing which we didn't really talk. Well, that's beautiful. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. It will happen. It will happen inevitably. And you know what? Actually, the thing is that these claims of genocide in the Donbass, Mr. Putin claimed that there was a genocide of Russians in the Donbass. And then there was this article in KP, the former Komsomolskaya Pravda, with an interview of one of separatist leaders in the Donbass who said, you know what, this is terrible. The children and grandchildren come back from school and they are Ukrainians. But actually, you are Ukrainians as well, right? Because Donbass actually had, before the war, the Ukrainian majority. It just had the Russian-speaking majority, but ethnic Ukrainian. So you have people coming back from school, deconstructing imperial identity, understanding that, you know, these are the downtrodden, the peasants who faced the genocidal famine from Stalin and all kinds of things. So speaking their language restores justice in a variety of ways. And it will inevitably happen. And also, there is a very interesting idea from the Ukrainian administration of President Zelensky. I just like this idea and principle of introducing English as yet another language of administration. And it is so funny. It's not good. Never, no. It will happen de facto. But so you can do that. And that also actually, you know, that kind of knocks out all this imperialistic reasoning that but Russian is the language of international communication. So many millions of people in Russia speak Russian. Blah, 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 blah. Wow, English is even more the language of international communication. Everybody in the world speaks English. What are you going to say to this? Okay, so I like it. Actually, there was, I think, yes, please.
If it's me,
It was you, yes.
then I have to say that someone who begins her day with news and tears and ends with the same as a Russian, teaching Russian, and someone who loves Ukraine dearly. I think that it is important to remember the names of the people who you start mentioning, like Andrei Sakharov, who belongs to the Humanities, less than Nelson Mandela, or Martin Luther King, and I am a bit surprised that among people, well, actually one person, well, two, you mentioned Alexei Navalny and actually first Serhy Yekelchyk, who is probably not the face of the opposition, and that I would like to mention a very important name of Boris Nemtsov, who was immediately talking about a criminal annexation of Crimea. And I would like to mention the name of Vladimir Karamurza, who a week ago got 25 years in prison, who was Boris Nemtsov's former demands. And those are just big names everyone remembers. I also want to, although I don't share many of the positions, but Grigory Yavlinsky made it part of their, Yabloko Apple party that, annexation of Crimea is illegal. And lots of on smaller level, like people who were trying to elect Democrats for Moscow municipal elections, which was like in 17th, and their question was who they would work with. Are you against Putin? Do you denounce the annexation of Crimea? I just want to say that it wasn't no voice of Serhy Yekelchyk, and now the voice that the world listens to Alexei.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. I recently went to one very, very affluent private college in Massachusetts and met no fewer than 3 Russian academics who were for a long time friends on Facebook, who left the country right away knowing that they would get arrested because of their position. So there are, in fact, of course, many more. But the problem is there is no platform, right? There is no platform, there is no way of actually raising the voice in such a way that it reaches out to the Russian audience and allows certain tools for people to mobilize. There is no equivalent of the Ukrainian platforms and media and the ever-present opposition and those writers who do things, right? So that is in fact a problem. But, while saying that I've met some wonderful Russians on that trip, I also lost some friends and colleagues. There was a historian in St. Petersburg who in the 90s was a friend of ours, came to dinner in our place. I went to dinner at his place, hotel in the 1990s. And then he became an imperial nationalist and a permanent presence at the Valdai Forum. And I was just reading his stuff like, what is this on earth going on with you? And then, of course, I also had to resign membership of the editorial board in 3 Russian journals because of the kinds of articles appearing in the journals and the kinds of statements made by the editor. And actually, I think most Western members resigned at the same time, too. So there is, and you know what? We have a relative cousin, my wife's cousin. My wife is actually in the audience. I'm not going to identify her. So he's a cousin, a woman who escaped to Poland with her daughter and the baby grandson. But she actually also has a very close relative who lives in Russia. And so she no longer actually talks to that very close relative who lives in Russia, because it's impossible to talk to him, because he's just basically reproducing all these things. And she now says that that Polish family which took them in is in fact the family now, and they're calling several times every week saying, because they went back to Ukraine, so that those Polish people calling them, please come back, we are keeping your rooms and such. And that redefines a ton of things at the level of grassroots diplomacy. And of course, there is a lot of blood between Poland and Ukraine as well. And not all of us are happy about the political parties in power in Poland now and their positions on various issues. But it is actually the direct contact with the Polish families which makes such an enormous difference. You know, if we look real hard, I also have some family in Russia. And for many people in my generation, they urbanized in Ukraine in the 1980s. Switching to speaking Ukrainian was a political choice because the cities were overwhelmingly Russophone. And I followed up on that by marrying a Ukrainian poet. And so that completed my transition, which was a political and a cultural one as well. And when I think about it, and what is happening now is, it is not going to be easy for Russia and Ukraine going forward, even if there is a new democratic Russia, because it took Germany and Poland how many decades to even start the process. Usually 1972 is the moment which is marked at the beginning of this reconciliation process. So it took a few decades. I'm really sad about it. But I'm also hopeful. And that's the reason why I brought up the notion of a full stadium, the biggest one in Kiev, gathering there to mourn the passing of Andrei Sakharov, because there was once that powerful democratic Russia, which prevented Mikhail Gorbachev, by the way, from organizing a coup in the Baltic republics when he wanted to go violent and basically put Boris Puga on a long leash and basically indicated to them, you can do things, and I will afterwards acknowledge that that was fine. But when they went violent, it was in fact the Russian Democrats who protested. So they were still then able at that point to raise the voice and scare Gorbachev into retreating, saying, oh, I didn't mean that, I didn't mean that. Yeah, I would be very much looking forward to being able to send our students to study in Russia, which we can no longer because Canada is, of course, on the list of unfriendly countries. In fact, the Russian Ministry of Education called on Russian students to leave Canadian universities and come back. At least 2 major Russian universities actually created a special admission pass for those people disadvantaged by the evil Western countries, like the United States and Canada. Most Russian students at our university most definitely did not go back. Yeah.
I think we may have time for one more question.
Yeah. You please. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure I consider myself illuminated, but you mentioned that after the independence in 1991, there were 3 days of independence, and the
3 days of friendship with Russia.
The statement on the 27th, I'm not familiar with it. Can you tell me more about it? And also, has there been any continued impact from that? The neighbors really recognize it and care.
Yes, I will be able to answer that very quickly so that you also get a chance.
Yes.
Okay, but 27th of August 1991, Pavel Volshanov, the press secretary of Boris Yeltsin, receives instructions from his boss, who kind of in a typical way says, show them who is the master here, tells them that they can only leave if they sign a comprehensive treaty with the Russian Federation. Other than that, we reserve the right to claim territories. And it was actually exactly the same what Mr. Putin now uses against everybody else, saying, oh, but you did come into the Soviet Union with this territorial configuration. So if you want to leave now, you need to return to Russia those territories. So that argument was actually first used by Yeltsin on like 3 days after independence. It was not noticed widely in the Western media, but there were protests right away in Ukraine. Actually, that moment made the reputation of Leonid Kravchuk, because he was able to jump in on this fact. He was a speaker of the parliament, organize a press conference and say, wow, the empire strikes back. And so project himself as a leader of the nation. Before that, there were multiple issues about him. In fact, there were crowds chanting before the building of the Ukrainian parliament, Yeltsin, Yeltsin down with Kravchuk. Because at that moment, the reading was that Kravchuk is a communist functionary who will protect the authority of the old elites, whereas Yeltsin is in fact destroying the old elites and he will build a new state. So it wasn't particularly noticed in the West, but there were voices raised in Russia.
Did Ukraine ever sign such treaty?
Not that kind of a treaty, but which would acknowledge that certain territories were received by, benefactory hand of the Empress or whatever, or Lenin. But there were several treaties signed with Russia. The Comprehensive Treaty in 1997, which recognized territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, which was seen as the moment when the issues were solved. The Black Sea Fleet was divided at that moment. Because prior to that, run jointly by the two countries, and it was a total disaster for Ukraine because the Russian officers were receiving their salaries 5 times, basically. So everybody thought that 1997 was then the moment when, after which there would be no territorial claims, but it just continued as a permanent presence in Russian politics, especially center right and right. But basically, your question.
Thank you very much. So it's a very practical question. So when you're in Ukraine, everything is clear. Like revolution is revolution, it's not cool, right? And Bucha, we know who made it. But when you are here and you're like sometimes outside your bubble who understand the same things like you, there are books right now, publications that it was cool, and people don't talk about Tatars and Bucha, we don't know who made it. So my question is, how can we talk about that? Because their arguments like you should negotiate, you should, and again, you guys don't have to give the weapon, etc., etc. So my question is again, like, how should we talk about it to the people will understand that peace for us, it means the victory of Ukraine. It's not negotiation.
Yeah, you know what? I often talk about the American Revolution when I'm asked a question like that in an American. So you realize by now, most of my jokes are about Canadian history, right? And things going on there. But I do have my small arsenal of jokes about the American history. And that is, of course, also comparing the fact that saying, well, the American Revolution was made by people who spoke English. Therefore, they should have been with the British Empire, if you use Mr. Putin's logic. But they didn't want to. And it involved violence. But it also involved something very important, democracy. Human rights. The French and the American revolutions introduced this notion, popular sovereignty, human rights, things like that. So this is the opposite of what Mr. Putin is pushing. Because ultimately, and this is a really unpopular statement, but Ukraine is fighting on behalf of the Russian society. That is absolutely true. That's what is going on. And I use my metaphor of, the riot police being intercepted, but it's more than that. Because it is the Ukrainian victory which would allow the Russian society its say. So when having this type of conversations, say essentially, what you arguing that the Boston Tea Party was a big mistake. And it was also violent. Therefore, they should have submitted to the British Empire right away and repaid all these damages and taxes and never claim any representation. What representation? So, but also, Mr. Putin has made it very easy to appeal to widely accepted notions of human rights, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide by starting the war after declaring that Ukrainians are really the same people. And therefore, whoever is a political Ukrainian not identifying with Russia, then is the enemy. And that is really a trap for him. And the court in The Hague was actually waiting for his another something. And then he went along and said, oh, I actually personally organized this program of, taking Ukrainian kids from Ukraine. I said, bingo, we have been waiting for this. Okay, now you said it. Okay, you are a war criminal. Here we go. You're going to be indicted. And these things, they do resonate because North American society is very well aware of things like Nuremberg and the Holocaust, and also increasingly the genocide of Aboriginal populations, the cultural and divided genocide. So by appealing to these points, it's quite easy. And, as I said, all these notions of, if you are an ethnic Russian, you must be my man, whatever. If you speak Russian, you should welcome our thanks. These are basically Hitler solutions. They're very recognizable, easy to identify with, easy to explain as well that these are very un-American values. If we try to reach out to the American values which have humanitarian value today in our world, the things Mr. Putin does are in fact very imperial and Nazi-like and criminal. And he consistently paints himself into the corner in one way or the other. It is enormously difficult to defend him. It really is. Yeah, I know. I get lots of questions like that too, especially from the European leftists. And that then requires a 2-hour lecture about the nature of state capitalism in Russia, what Lenin would have said, what kind of compromises Marx would consider, whether you can support the Iranian regime of Ayatollahs against the Iranian women, and then I go on for 2 hours about that, right? But I think there are very clear points of reference, especially related to World War II and Nuremberg and human rights and genocide, that are fairly familiar, and people are not necessarily informed about what is behind the American position on Russia. And they also have an image of Russia which is highly idealized. Very often they confuse communism and Mr. Putin. Even so, Mr. Putin says Lenin was guilty of everything and also created Ukraine and whatever. So Lenin did everything. It's a tough struggle. It requires a response which is tailored towards your audience. So you need to have your jokes for Canada and your examples for the United States. Because, at first when I was saying, but could you even imagine, an empire treating the Aboriginals this way in the Crimea? And then people look at me like that. I realize, they think that the empire is a good thing. Okay, so I have to start them with a different one, because you get that kind of response to occasionally, especially in places like Victoria, especially. Also, it is changing very fast. Yeah, but it's a struggle.
Thank you.
Once again, yes, and 2 hours.
Thank you.